Spinoza found it. One Hebrew word, 7 letters, and from that single word a doctrine that shaped 2 billion lives was born, and it was never in the original. I want to begin there, because the thing I am going to show you today is not a marginal curiosity from the edges of biblical scholarship. It is not a fringe argument or the kind of claim that only circulates in forums where people already want to believe it. It is a textual fact, observable in documents that have been sitting in academic libraries for 2 centuries, available to anyone with the patience to look. The problem is not that the evidence is hidden. The problem is the question that nobody thought to ask from the pulpit. A single Hebrew word. The letter sequence Aleph Mem He. 7 characters, depending on which pointing system you use. A word that appeared 14 times in the Hebrew Bible, without once requiring sexual purity as part of its meaning. And then, 250 years before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, in a library in Alexandria that was attempting to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek for a community that could no longer read its own ancestral language, that word was translated as something it had never meant. That translation decision, made by a committee of scholars in a city built by a Macedonian general, became the linguistic foundation for a doctrine that 2 billion people today take as the revealed truth of God. Spinoza saw it. He traced the mechanism. And what he described in doing so was not simply an error. He described how certainty is manufactured, how a scribal choice, made for reasons that had nothing to do with divine revelation, becomes the unexamined foundation of a faith. I need to take you through this carefully, because to understand what Spinoza found, you have to go back to 740 years before the Common Era, and a conversation between a frightened king and a prophet who was trying to calm him down. But before I do that, I want to tell you how I came to this question, not as a theological abstraction, as a moment that settled something in me that had been loose for years. It was a reading room. I will not name the institution more precisely than to say it was one of the better research libraries in the east of England, the kind of place that holds its older acquisitions with a particular kind of institutional seriousness. Books requested through a call slip, delivered on a padded trolley, set down in front of you with the slight formality of something that has been preserved against your carelessness. The windows faced north. That specific flat English light, the kind that arrives without warmth regardless of the season, was landing across the reading desk at a low angle. This was in the mid-1990s. I had been working through a reference volume on Septuagint translation methodology, not a central text, a technical work, the kind of scholarly grammar that most people who write about the Septuagint use without reading cover to cover. I had been reading it in sections over several weeks, working through the parts relevant to a seminar I was preparing. I had known about the almah parthenos debate for years. I want to be clear about that. I was not a person who had been kept from this information. I had encountered the argument in postgraduate work, had seen it in footnotes, had filed it under the category of issues that serious scholars acknowledge, and then set aside because they are peripheral to the main argument being made. And then, in a footnote in that technical volume, a subordinate clause in a footnote, the grammatical equivalent of an afterthought, I read something that made me put the book face down on the desk. The note observed in passing that the Septuagint translators had the Greek word neanis available to them when they translated Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14. Neanis. Young woman, no connotation of sexual purity whatsoever. They chose not to use it. They used parthenos instead. And the note added, without apparent awareness of the weight it was distributing, that 3 later Greek translators, Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion, working independently in the 2nd century of the Common Era, all 3 chose neanis when they retranslated the same passage. I put the book down. The tea in the cup beside me had gone cold at some point without my noticing. I sat with that for a while. Not with excitement. That is not the right word for what it was. It was the feeling of a floor that has always been slightly uneven, suddenly making sense. Not the discovery that the floor is uneven. I had always felt it, had simply accepted that floors in old buildings sometimes are, but understanding for the first time precisely where the joist had shifted and why. The argument was not new. It had been made before. What was new to me, sitting in that reading room with the north-facing light beginning to fail toward afternoon, was the full sharpness of what it implied. If the translators had a word available that was accurate, a word that 3 later scholars independently chose when they did the job properly, then the choice of parthenos was not a translation. It was a decision, and decisions have reasons. I drove home later and thought about it for a long time. So, who was Isaiah speaking to, and what did he actually say? The chapter is 7. The year is approximately 740 before the Common Era. The political situation in Judah is acute. 2 neighboring kingdoms, Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel, have formed an alliance and are threatening to invade. King Ahaz of Judah is, by the text's own description, shaking like leaves in a wind. Isaiah comes to Ahaz with a message. It is not primarily a messianic prophecy. It is a political communication addressed to a frightened king about a specific military situation. The core of the message is, these 2 kingdoms threatening you will be dealt with. A sign will be given to you. A young woman is with child, and the child will be born. And before the child is old enough to know the difference between good and bad, the land of the 2 kings you fear will be abandoned. That is the context, not a prophecy addressed to the future, a political assurance addressed to a present crisis. The child who will be born is a sign that the threat Ahaz faces will be resolved within years, within a childhood specifically. The Hebrew word Isaiah uses for the young woman is almah, aleph mem he. Now here is what you need to know about that word. The Hebrew Bible has a completely different word for virgin in the technical sense of a woman who has never been sexually active. That word is basula. It appears in the book of Deuteronomy in exactly that context, chapters 22, in passages dealing with questions of sexual purity and the legal consequences of disputed virginity. When the Hebrew Bible wants to specify that a woman is a virgin in that precise sense, it uses Bethula. Isaiah did not use Bethula, he used almah. Almah appears 7 times in the Hebrew Bible. Rebekah at the well in Genesis 24, translated variously as young woman, girl, maiden. Miriam, the sister of Moses, in Exodus chapter 2. The young women of Proverbs 30, a passage about the incomprehensibility of certain wonders, including the way of a man with a young woman, in a context that makes biological youth, not virginity, the relevant quality. In the Song of Songs, the companions of the beloved. None of these appearances in their context require sexual purity as any part of their meaning. Almah means young woman, a woman in the span of youth. It carries no technical implication about her sexual history. In a moment, I will show you the oldest surviving copy of Isaiah, not a translation, the Hebrew from a manuscript that predates the standard Masoretic text by 1,000 years. And what it says in chapter 7 verse 14 is not what you were told it says. But first, that is not even the most important part. The important part is what happened in Alexandria. And I want to warn you about something before I go further. What I am about to show you about how institutions handle inconvenient textual evidence, it does not stay safely in the ancient world. I have watched this mechanism operate in my own professional lifetime. Keep that in mind as we go. In approximately 250 years before the Common Era, a translation project was undertaken that would shape the history of Western religion more than perhaps any other single document. A large community of Jews living in Alexandria, educated, Greek-speaking, integrated into the intellectual culture of the Hellenistic world, needed the Hebrew scriptures in a language they could actually use. Their ancestral Hebrew had become, for many of them, a language of scholarship rather than daily life. A group of scholars, the number 72, later rounded to 70, gives the translation its name, the Septuagint, from the Latin for 70, produced a Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures. It was a monumental undertaking, and in most respects it was done with serious scholarly care. When they reached Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14, they translated almah as parthenos. Greek had 2 relevant words available. Neanis, young woman, the straightforward equivalent of almah, carrying no implication of sexual status. And parthenos, a word with an explicit connotation of sexual purity. A maiden, specifically, in the sense that carries the weight of that word. Not simply young, inviolate. They chose parthenos. I want you to hold for a moment the significance of the fact that they had a choice. They knew both words. They used neanis elsewhere in the Septuagint, in passages where it was appropriate. The word was available. The decision to use parthenos rather than neanis in this one passage was not a translation forced on them by a limited vocabulary. It was a selection from available options. Why might they have made that choice? Here is where the historical context matters, and where Spinoza's method of asking about the condition of the people who produced a text becomes illuminating. The Jewish scholars in Alexandria were living inside a Hellenistic intellectual world, a world saturated with stories of divine beings who fathered children through extraordinary means. Perseus, son of Zeus, and a mortal woman, Romulus and Remus, the concept of a miraculous birth, of divine power entering human lineage through a woman, was not a novel theological idea in 250 BC Alexandria. It was the theological currency of the world around them. Some scholars have argued, carefully, not conclusively, that the Septuagint translators may have been influenced by the theological weight that parthenos carried in that cultural context, that they found in Isaiah's almah an echo of something that would resonate with readers familiar with the Greek tradition of divine births. Whether that is the reason or not, the decision was made. Alma became parthenos. The Septuagint translation of Isaiah 7:14 said parthenos, and for the next 2 centuries, nobody needed to question it, because the prophecy had not yet been applied to any particular birth. And then a carpenter's son from Galilee made the question necessary. There are 3 moments where the translation decision could have been corrected, 3 points in the historical chain where someone with access to the Hebrew original could have said, wait, the word is almah. This is not what the text requires. The first moment was in Alexandria itself at the time of the translation. That moment passed. The second moment was when the author of the Gospel of Matthew built his account of the Nativity. Let me be precise about what happens in Matthew chapter 1, verses 22 and 23. The author writes, "All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel." He is quoting Isaiah. Specifically, he is quoting the Greek Septuagint translation of Isaiah, not the Hebrew original. The word in Matthew's quotation is parthenos, the Septuagint's word, not Isaiah's word. The scholarly consensus on this, and Bart Ehrman, whose textual analysis of the New Testament's manuscript tradition I find among the most rigorous available, has written extensively on exactly this point, is that the author of Matthew's Gospel worked from the Septuagint throughout. His citations of the Hebrew scriptures consistently follow the Septuagint pattern rather than the Hebrew Masoretic text. When Matthew quotes the Hebrew Bible, he is not quoting it. He is quoting a Greek translation of it. This is not a minor textual footnote. It means that the prophecy fulfillment that Matthew presents as evidence of Jesus' divine origin, the virgin birth as the sign that Isaiah foretold, depends entirely on the Septuagint's translation choice. If Matthew had been reading the Hebrew, he would have read almah, young woman. And the passage in Isaiah, in context, is a political assurance addressed to a frightened king about a military situation that was resolved within a generation. It has nothing to do with a birth 700 years later. What Spinoza identified in the Tractatus, and this is the argument that earned the book its immediate placement on the index of forbidden books, was this. Matthew built the prophecy fulfillment backwards. He found a passage in the existing texts that could be made to fit the events of Jesus' birth. The passage worked only because the Septuagint translation had introduced parthenos. Without that translation decision made 250 years before Matthew wrote, the passage in Isaiah does not support the claim Matthew is making. Take away the translation error, and there is no prophecy. The prophecy exists because of the mistranslation, not despite it. And here is the contradiction that Spinoza could not ignore, and that I have been sitting with for a very long time. If the virgin birth doctrine rests on a passage that was applied to a birth it was never intended to address, using a translation of a word that misrepresents the original Hebrew, what does that mean for the architecture of the doctrine that was built on it? Now I should show you what the oldest surviving copy of Isaiah actually says. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd near the Dead Sea, searching for a lost goat, or so the story goes, and the mundane accuracy of that detail is part of what makes the discovery so strange to think about, threw a stone into a cave and heard pottery break. Inside were jars. Inside the jars were scrolls. The Great Isaiah Scroll, designated one Quaisa in the scholarly cataloging system, is the most complete ancient manuscript of the book of Isaiah that exists. It dates, from physical analysis, to approximately 125 years before the Common Era. It predates the standard Masoretic text that most modern Old Testament translations are based on by approximately 1,000 years. In Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, the Great Isaiah Scroll uses the word that Isaiah used, not Bethula, not a word that has any technical implication of sexual purity. The scroll uses LMH, almah, a young woman, the oldest surviving copy of the text, pre-Christian, predating the New Testament by more than a century, with no theological stake in what the word means for the nativity narrative. It uses almah. The argument that perhaps the original Hebrew had a different word, that perhaps the Septuagint was working from a text that said something other than what the Masoretic tradition preserves, that argument collapses in front of Qumran. The evidence is physical, pre-Christian, and unambiguous. The Hebrew word was always almah. The Greek translation chose parthenos. The two decisions belong to different people, in different centuries, for different reasons. And what followed from the second decision, compounded by Matthew's Gospel, was a doctrine accepted by 2 billion people today as divine revelation. So that settles it, you might say. The Hebrew says young woman. Simple. Except it is not simple at all. Because the interesting question is not what the text says, it is what happened when someone tried to say so out loud. Justin Martyr knew the objection. He heard it directly in a recorded conversation from a Jewish scholar. And what he did with it is one of the most revealing moments in the entire history of this debate. Around the year 155 of the Common Era, Justin engaged in a documented debate with a Jewish scholar named Trypho. In the dialogue with Trypho, Trypho raises exactly the point Spinoza would raise 15 centuries later. He challenges Justin on the word almah. He notes that the Hebrew original uses a word that means young woman, and that the Greek translation, parthenos, does not support that rendering. Justin's response is not to engage the Hebrew. I want you to hear this carefully. He does not make a linguistic argument. He does not examine the text. He accuses Trypho of corruption. Justin claims that Jewish scholars have deliberately obscured the prophecy, have tampered with their own scriptures to undermine Christian claims. Now hold what you know against what Justin is claiming. The Septuagint with parthenos is the older text. Aquila's neanis, the accurate word, is the later translation. What Justin accuses Jewish scholars of doing retroactively is precisely what happened in the original Septuagint in the other direction. The word was introduced by Jewish translators. It was corrected toward accuracy by later Jewish translators. The accusation of corruption was aimed at the people who were getting the word right, by the people defending the translation that had gotten it wrong. The inversion is not subtle, and by the time Justin Martyr was making this argument, the institutional stakes were already clear. And what the Church did next is the part of this that does not stay in the 2nd century. The Church Fathers, who came after Justin Martyr, understood that the virgin birth doctrine rested on the Septuagint's parthenos. They were not ignorant men. Several of them read Hebrew. They knew what almah meant, and that Isaiah had not used Bethula. They knew that 3 later Greek translators had independently produced neanis, the accurate rendering. The doctrine was not being defended in ignorance, it was being defended in knowledge, which is a different thing entirely. Jerome, translating the Hebrew scriptures into Latin in the late 4th century, the Latin Vulgate, which became the standard Bible of Western Christianity for more than a millennium, translated almah as virgo, virgin. Jerome was a serious scholar. He knew Hebrew. He had access to the Greek translators who had used neanis. He chose virgo. The institution could not acknowledge the word, so it protected the translation. The method was this. The Church declared that the Septuagint translation was itself divinely inspired. If the scholars in Alexandria were guided by God, if the selection of parthenos was not a human decision made under cultural pressures, but a divine act, a providential selection that anticipated the birth of Jesus, then the translation error is no longer an error. It is revelation. The argument is circular in a way that Spinoza would have identified immediately. You cannot prove that the translation was divinely inspired by pointing to the doctrine the translation makes possible, if the doctrine is only possible because of the translation. That is not evidence. That is the institution protecting its structure by elevating the source document above scrutiny. When you declare the source document inspired, you have placed it beyond examination. Every subsequent question becomes an act of faithlessness rather than scholarship. The linguistic argument is not answered. It is reclassified. It becomes heresy. And here is what I want to show you next, because what Spinoza concluded about this mechanism is not simply a historical observation. I will show you exactly what he found. The responsibility of knowing this is real. I am not telling you what to believe, but I am telling you that what was taught as divine revelation was, at the moment of its creation, a human choice about which Greek word to use. Made by Jewish scholars in Alexandria in 250 BC, who may have been influenced by the Hellenistic divine birth traditions around them, or may have had reasons we cannot reconstruct, or may simply have reached a different conclusion than the translators who came after them. A human choice, which became a doctrine, which became the unexamined foundation of the faith of 2 billion people. There is something I need to go back to, something I have been carrying since that reading room in the mid-1990s. The scholarly consensus that Matthew worked from the Septuagint is not controversial among people who study the text seriously. Ehrman makes the case clearly and at length. So do specialists who have examined the manuscript traditions across the Synoptic Gospels. And what they consistently observe is that the citations in Matthew follow Septuagint patterns throughout, not the Hebrew Masoretic text. The acknowledgement that Matthew quotes the Greek translation of Isaiah, not the Hebrew, is not a fringe position. It is the working assumption of anyone who has looked at this carefully. What is remarkable is not that the information exists. It exists in major works of mainstream biblical scholarship. The information is available. What is remarkable is that it does not appear in the places where it would matter most to the people most affected by it. I have thought about this a great deal over the years, sitting with it quietly. Not with anger, the anger faded a long time ago, but with something I can only describe as a persistent low unease. The kind of unease that surfaces when you understand something fully, and know that the understanding is not welcome in the places where it matters most. There is a question that forms itself in my mind in certain quiet moments, the kind of question that does not resolve and is not meant to. How many people have said the creed, have stood and said the words about the virgin birth week after week, year after year, without ever being told that the word in the original Hebrew was almah, and that 3 Greek translators, working independently and rigorously, all chose a different word? That question has stayed with me for a long time. But there is a category of information that is technically available and institutionally suppressed, not through direct censorship, but through the accumulated weight of what is and is not considered appropriate to explain from the pulpit, in confirmation class, in the settings where people form their understanding of what they believe. The footnote stays in the footnote. The doctrine stands in the creed, year after year, decade after decade. I want to show you now exactly what Spinoza concluded. The Church put the Tractatus on the index of forbidden books immediately, and the chapters examining prophetic language were considered its most dangerous sections. Spinoza's argument about prophecy is this: prophecy is not knowledge in the ordinary sense. It is the projection of the human imagination, shaped by its historical moment, its cultural context, its institutional pressures, onto the idea of divine intention. When Isaiah spoke to Ahaz about a young woman and a child, he was communicating a political assurance in terms comprehensible to the people present. Those words belong to a prophet addressing a crisis in 740 BC Judah. When Matthew takes that passage and applies it to a different birth, 700 years later, in a different country, he is performing exactly the operation that Spinoza describes as the manufacture of prophetic authority. taking a human text from a specific historical context and extracting it to serve a new theological argument. The extraction is possible only because the translation introduced parthenos, a word that opened the passage to an application its original language had never supported. The doctrine of the virgin birth in Spinoza's analysis is a case study in how religious authority is manufactured. Through the accumulation of decisions, a translator's choice in 250 BC, an evangelist reading Greek rather than Hebrew, the Church Fathers' investment in the resulting claim, the institutional declaration that the translation was divinely inspired, each decision layering over the ones before it, until what is visible at the top is doctrine, and what is buried below is a sequence of human choices. Spinoza published the Tractatus anonymously. No name, no city, a false publisher on the title page. He understood what happened to people who made certain arguments too clearly. He published anyway. And then I put both texts down. Almah on the left, parthenos on the right, and I thought, it is just two words, just a translator's choice. Except it is not, is it? One Hebrew word, in an address to a frightened king in 740 BC, about a child who would be born to mark the end of a military threat. That word meant young woman. The political crisis resolved. The prophecy was fulfilled in the context in which it was made, generations before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. 250 years later, scholars in Alexandria chose a word that introduced a quality the original had not specified. They chose parthenos. 250 years after that, an author composing a gospel in Greek, working from the Greek translation, found in that passage a fulfilment, using a translation that had introduced the key word, and then the mechanism of institutional protection took over. The translation was declared inspired. The Hebrew scholars who objected were accused of corruption. The doctrine was layered into the creed, into the Annunciation narrative, into the theology of the Incarnation, until what was visible at the surface was a central claim of Christian faith, and what lay beneath it was a footnote in a technical volume on Septuagint methodology that made me put a book face down on a desk in a reading room on a cold afternoon in the 1990s. I am not telling you what the virgin birth means as a matter of faith. That is not mine to adjudicate, but what was presented as a prophecy fulfilled is a passage extracted from its original context, applied through a translation that misrepresented the source, to a situation the original author was not addressing. And the institution that built a doctrine on that foundation chose, when the foundation was examined, to protect the doctrine rather than acknowledge the examination. I have spent a long time sitting with that, not with rage, not with the clean satisfaction of finding something to destroy, with the specific heaviness of knowing something that changes the texture of everything without giving you anything clean to put in its place. Almah, a young woman, standing somewhere in a conversation between a prophet and a frightened king, in a city under threat, 740 years before the Common Era. Her name unrecorded, her story resolved within years in the way that political crises resolve. She was not the beginning of a doctrine. She was a woman in a moment of crisis, present in a conversation that took place in a specific time for specific reasons. The word was always almah. The floor was always slightly uneven. Now you know where the joist shifted. Take care of yourselves.
What I shared today, it took me years to accept. Tell me in the comments if this changed something for you. Sometimes the truth is uncomfortable, but it's still the truth.